But welcome everybody. Be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button.
I remember in middle school when you felt self-conscious if you were the last one to go through puberty. That really went topsy-turvy, didn't it?
Sometimes the it's too much explaining yourself and it's too apologetic.
Be sure to hit the notifications bell.
I actually do believe Israel won't just bomb countless civilians.
Be sure to tweet this out. Be sure to put this up on your Facebook.
You have to be kind to people. Be kind to the guys in this mess in the first place.
Put this up on your Reddit.
Chile is a country.
Be sure to cut and paste a link to this to go into your favorite Facebook chat group.
It's good to see so many normal people in here.
Now, spanking isn't just my deep, dark personal secret. It's America's deep, dark secret.
I've never seen it explained so simply anywhere.
Put this on WhatsApp. Put this on Telegram. Put this on your favorite messenger app.
Hello, and welcome to the Untitled Anarchist Seagull channel. I'm your host, an Untitled Anarchist Seagull called Elise. And we have, I think, a pretty good show coming up. I realized that I had neglected to provide porcupines yesterday, and I will be providing porcupines this time. I feel like all the bullshit going on, we probably all could use some porcupines. So there will be porcupines. And other than that, I don't know if everyone's seen it, but there was actually, contrary to a lot of claims in the media that, everybody's kind of chill with all this bullshit that's going on, actually there was a big protest in San Diego against ICE today. For all I know, it's still going on. It kicked off pretty well, judging from the pictures. So, yeah, anyone who's saying that nothing's going on is not paying attention, or they're full of shit and would prefer that nothing was going on. In the case of the New York Times, it seems to me it's pretty clear what side they're on. So, I think we might start out with a bit of porcupine.
What do you think, Teddy? You enjoying your frozen banana? How good is it?
Okay, that actually sounded like words. Oh, that voice.
Is it helping to cool you off on this hot summer day?
And just so anyone who's interested in the channel that brings us this amazing little creature with the cartoon voice, I just dropped a link in chat. I, after all, did not find the porcupine, or did not film this porcupine, they did. And I'm eternally grateful to them for doing so. Knowing that porcupines make these little noises has improved my life no end, and I hope it does yours as well.
Good boy, Teddy Bear.
Okay. Now, we had started out looking with a video where Caleb Muppet was explaining what imperialism / globalism is. And we'd only just started out, and he had just basically sort of fallen into sort of an endless loop where he kept on saying it's an economic system and then saying that again. I thought we might continue with that for a bit.
Level. One looks to pauperism, ignorance, deep...
Oh, that's right. He had this really shitty sort of quote. I'll back it up, because you have to actually hear the whole thing to make sense out of this, you know. This is some quote from some guy in the Civil War who's trying to explain why, like, what, capitalism and imperialism aren't the same thing, or something. I don't know what the fuck the point of this quote is, apart from it says some really racist things.
Wrote explaining the way in this pamphlet fought a revolution against the British. Why is it that in America, we're this modern country that fought a revolution against the British, why do we have slavery? And in this pamphlet that Henry Charles Carey wrote, explaining the way the slave economy in the South worked and how that was contrary to the North and everything that he wrote, he ended his pamphlet with this very, very important passage. This is what Henry Charles Carey wrote. Two systems are before the world. One looks to exporting men to occupied desert tracts.
Okay. I'm just looking at his Wikipedia entry because I'm not familiar with him. Okay, Carey's central work is the harmony of interests, agricultural, manufacturing, and commercial. Those are apparently the only interests, which criticizes the system of laissez-faire capitalism and free trade expounded by Malthus and Ricardo in favor of the American system of developmentalism through the use of tariff protection and state intervention to encourage national self-sufficiency and unity. He was also a critic of the practice of slavery from an economic perspective. His work on protective tariffs was largely influential on the early Republican Party and United States trade policy through the start of the 20th century. His views on banking and monetary policy were adopted by the Lincoln administration. Yeah, okay, what else? Let's see, anything else interesting here about him? Essay on the rate of wages. He retired from active business with a fortune, so yes, okay. He was also a vile exploiter of workers. Okay, supported the Russian Empire against Britain in the Crimean War, despite, as the article points out, the Russian institution of serfdom, which is kind of interesting position for a guy who claimed to be some kind of an abolitionist. I mean, fuck the British Empire, but... Carey's views are generally described as nationalist. He's anti-Malthusian. I mean, considering that Caleb loves to call anyone he doesn't like a Malthusian, I can see where... Letter to a farmer of Ohio. Okay. Here, I'm just going to drop this link into chat for anyone interested. I hadn't heard of this guy, but that's basically who he is, and this is who he's quoting.
The sovereignty of which is obtained by aid of diplomacy or war. The other, to increasing the value of an immense extent of vacant land by importing men.
Vacant land. He's talking, of course, about Turtle Island, which was not vacant. In fact, especially at that time. I mean, like, at that time, it was definitely very obviously not vacant, because a lot of the genocide hadn't really happened yet. A lot of it had, but quite a bit was yet to come.
By millions for their occupation. One looks to the concentration of wealth and power in a great commercial city, which shall rival the great cities of modern times, which have been and are being supported by aid and contributions which have exhausted every nation subjected to them. The other, to concentration by aid of which a market shall be made upon the land for the products of the land.
And the thing is, he's talking about these things like they're two fundamentally different things. They're two sides of the same coin. You have one, you need the other. They're not, it's a ridiculous, he's just describing capitalism at different moments or from different angles.
And the farmer and the planter be enriched. One looks to increasing the necessity for commerce. The other to increasing the power to maintain it. One looks to underworking the...
Speaking of the farmer, I just can't help thinking of all of these articles I've seen where people who are described as like farmers in California who are complaining that their produce is rotting because the workers are staying away because they don't want to be picked up by ice. And I can't help thinking, if these people who are called farmers can still be there, nobody's picking them up, but without these other people who are never called farmers, the produce would go to waste. It sounds like maybe actually those people aren't farmers to begin with. It sounds like maybe they just own the land on which farmers are working.
Hindu, and sinking the rest of the world to his level. The other to raising the standard of man throughout the world to our level. One looks to pauperism, ignorance, depopulation, and barbarism. The other to increasing wealth, comfort, intelligence, combination.
Yeah, and this is so wild to hear him quoting this. When he's actually rather frequently quoted bits about, bits from Marx and Engels talking about how, again, these are two sides of the same coin, and the system that in both versions that this Carey fellow is describing has the main distinction that it somehow manages to massively increase wealth without doing anything to reduce misery.
Of action and civilization. One looks toward universal war, the other toward universal peace.
Which is a meaningless word. The people who are looking toward universal war are usually doing it because they have very specific ideas about the kind of peace they want. And they think that war will get them that. That's why when somebody says, "Oh, I want peace," you have to actually ask what that means. Like that, there's this liberal Zionist dickhead, Gershon Baskin. He occasionally has published some useful things just from his experience as a negotiator in talks with the Palestinian resistance in the past. So not completely devoid of value, his writings, but still a liberal Zionist. And he's talking about, hey, Riveroon. He was on Twitter saying, what I would like to tell the Palestinians is they need to make peace with Israel. And it's like, what the fuck? That's your takeaway from these past 50 months is the Palestinians need to make peace? Like, this guy cannot have the excuse of ignorance, because he's been involved in the negotiations with Hamas. He knows perfectly well what the history is, and the history is that Israel responds to Hamas peace overtures with fucking massacres. But, and aside from that, it's like, how are you going to tell people that they should, peacefully coexist with a regime that is explicitly committed to exterminating them, and is full of people who are enthusiastic about that goal, when there's been no accountability and no sign of anything that could actually mean never, that this isn't going to happen again. But I mean, that's the thing. You say peace. What does peace mean?
One is the English system. The other, we may be proud to call the American system.
Except the thing about the English system is that the English system, see, the distinction he's making is between, developmentalism and protectionism. But the English system was extremely protectionist for England. Yeah, I mean, they mean subordination. They want to, they want to minimize overt conflict while getting to keep all this shit they shouldn't have. I mean, the whole so-called system of free trade, as the British Empire called it, was extremely protectionist, because what they did was all of their colonies that they invaded and occupied were not allowed to compete economically with British industry. That's why, Britain reverse engineered the highly advanced Indian textile industry. Imported, when they figured out how to do it, they set that up in the mills of Manchester and other major textile areas in Britain, and then they banned India doing the same, continuing to have their industry. And they did that in all sorts of places. They did that here as well. I mean, that was one of the things that the sort of colonial ruling class were pissed off about, was that there were restrictions on what kind of finished goods they could make. Because the whole point of the British Empire is to bring profit to the British capital, not some colonial bourgeois upstarts, but the people who own the shit back in the home country. I mean, so this is silly, actually. I mean, maybe this was not sorry about that, obvious to carry back in the mid-19th century, but it's certainly quite obvious now and has been amply written about.
For it is the only one ever devised, the tendency of which was that of elevating while equalizing the condition of man throughout the world. And such is the true mission of the United States. Now, that's a heavy passage from Henry Charles Carey. He's saying quite a lot there.
Yeah, I mean, nothing that somebody who is familiar with any serious critique of capitalism would have any trouble picking apart.
But what is he saying? He's saying that England has set up this global empire that is all about concentrating the wealth of the world in a mighty city. It's all about seizing chunks of the world.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is, this is exactly what the U.S. does. In fact, I mean, quite explicitly. You go and you look at, planning documents, especially from, the early years when they were really just realizing, in Washington, that the world was their oyster, basically, that nobody was going to be able to be a serious challenge to them for decades, and they could just make it in their image. And they said, the key thing is going to be making sure that what they called their service areas, which is also known as Latin America, Africa, most of Asia, which were there for resources and cheap labor, would develop in a way that complemented U.S. capital rather than competing with it. And in fact, I mean, when you look at the sort of the free trade agenda with NAFTA, the WTO, all that stuff that you don't hear as much about anymore. It's still around. Like, these so-called free trade agreements, all this bullshit, that's still there. It doesn't get talked about as much. But the way that was set up was specifically so that countries, say, in Latin America, could not use the same sort of protective measures that the U.S. and Britain and Germany, all the major developed, dynamic economies in the world, used in order to attain that position. So that they would only be able to develop in a complementary way rather than competing.
Seizing desert tracts. It's about universal war. It's about underworking the Hindu and sinking the rest of the world down to his level.
Wait, yeah, we missed that line when I replayed it. Yeah, I mean, and that's racist as hell. But of course he's just gonna say it. I mean, and of course, again, the question that Carrie and Muppet seem uninterested in asking is, why exactly were people in India in that state? Could it be something to do with the fact that, they were being colonized by Britain economically?
He's talking about when the British Empire went to India and burned all the textile looms and forced the people of India to import their cloth from Britain.
I mean, which is a version of what the U.S. is doing as well, has all along. That's what freaks them out. In places that try to move away from extractivism, which is, even timidly away from it, since that's like the only thing that that the U.S. thinks you should be allowed to have as an economy in Latin America. When they start actually trying to compete, then all of a sudden, the U.S. claims to be worried about human rights there.
He's talking about depopulation, driving down the population, driving down living standards. And he's saying that in opposition to it, the economic principles of Alexander Hamilton and some of the American revolutionaries, the anti-slavery wing of the American Revolution, was an economy
except, you can't just say the anti-slavery wing there, because it doesn't cut quite that easily.
On economic growth. And like he talks about one...
And again, here he goes on about growth and stuff, but the thing is, this is the 19th century. I wonder if anything's changed since then. He does the same thing when he's really reading Marx and Engels and saying, oh, we need to massively increase production and stuff like that. And it's like, well, yes, in the 19th century you would have had to. We did that. That's happened already. There's been 100 years gone by since they wrote, 150, since they wrote that stuff. Production is actually at unbelievably high levels. That's not the problem anymore.
About increasing the necessity of commerce, of selling and buying, right? That you constantly have to be selling and buying. And the other is about increasing the power to maintain it, meaning increasing technology, increasing the amount of wealth that's being produced so that commerce just kind of naturally goes on because wealth is expanding. So one is about constantly, financializing everything. And the other is about...
And here we go. And Doug Henwood has a line. I have a number of disagreements with him, but this is a good line. It puts a good point on it. Says, you should kind of always be wary of any critique of finance that isn't a critique of capital. Because that is a direction fascists love to go in. He didn't say that second part. It's in the essay that's from, he makes that clear. But the line is just, it ends with capital.
About building and developing. And he's describing two very distinct economic modes, and he's talking about how in Britain...
Not that distinct, though. Because, again, the things that he's describing coexist. Like, the U.S. protectionism, that got the U.S. a steel industry that coexisted with these forced unilateral open door policies that the U.S. was imposing on Latin America, on certain parts of Asia and the Pacific, and other places during that period. Same thing with Britain. You had protectionism at home, developmentalism at home, but abroad you had, again, unilateral open door policies, which were called free trade, even though they weren't.
The City of London, the London Stock Exchange, that dominates the world, that maintains huge fleets and controls the trade routes, that sinks whole nations into poverty while building up just one little city, that drives down living standards, that impoverishes and deindustrializes the country it takes over, right? That is this new system. He's describing the English system. And against it, he contrasts the ideas of...
I mean, this is just... I just can't get over this. Because, okay, maybe Carrie did not see that these things were coexisting. I mean, I wouldn't... It was pretty obvious. People wrote about how they were coexisting at the time he was writing this bullshit. So, I mean, it's a bit of an oversight, I have to say. But, you know, we've got a lot of hindsight on him at this point. And it's pretty clear they coexist. They're not distinct systems. They are, I mean, they are the same system depending on what it wears around the house and what it wears to go out.
Alexander Hamilton and himself, the idea that the state should invest in building infrastructure like lighthouses and roads. There should be a national bank that oversees economic development and is focused on building up physical economy. That there was an economy at that time that was emerging, that was about the rule of the world by bankers, not manufacturers.
Yeah, okay, now we're getting into, like, literal Hitler territory. When, yeah, I mean, this, like, bankers versus manufacturers, that's schaffendes und raffendes Kapital. Like, this is literally Nazi shit that he's doing, this, you know, acting like these are fundamental distinctions. But, like, I mean, this, you know, we've sometimes asked how, when he's quoting all this, like, all this stuff from Marx and everything like that, and materialism, how much of it he actually comprehends, and we've expressed, you know, me and Chad and lots of other people who have observed him. That's kind of a personal question, I have to say. To just sort of ask randomly. But, I mean, this is just proof that he really does not comprehend it, because the thing is, the reason the US and, yeah, fucking Britain were at very different stages of capitalism, because the US was actually at this time still catching up to Britain, still catching up to Western Europe. They were only just really beginning to fully develop their industries. Oh, I mean, and a lot of them, they hadn't even really started developing yet.
Manufacturers, who were essentially making the world poorer and poorer and poorer, and centering themselves and their mighty cities as global middlemen. Everyone who has to trade.
I mean, this is the silliest thing about this. I mean, there's so many. They're just it's a very, very silly thing. But, I mean, the thing about it is that this idea that you can make this neat distinction between manufacturing and finance is nonsense, because the entire system is based on acquiring financial assets. Finance is everywhere in capitalism because money is everywhere in capitalism. There isn't somebody who is purely industrial and not financial, and there's nobody who's purely financial and not industrial, because all that financial shit is based at some level, even if it is heavily abstracted from it, on actual fucking production. At some point, the reason there is money coming off of one of these pieces of paper that gets traded on the exchanges and, Frankfurt and Washington, New York and fucking London, wherever. The reason is that there are real assets. There is real production going on. This idea that these are completely separate things is just complete bullshit.
Has to go through them and impoverishing the world. And that was in opposition to the vision of Alexander Hamilton and himself and other figures in the American Revolution of an industrial economy based on actually expanding the wealth and living standards of man. Now that was
of which ones though?
Very, very beginning. This was, I believe, that pamphlet was published in the 1840s, possibly earlier. Karl Marx read that pamphlet, and he said it was the only economic writing in America of any merit. And he said that Henry Charles Carey was the only economist in America of any worth or merit. And that's...
I'm okay, now I'm curious. Marx, Henry Charles Carey, what did he actually say? What exactly? Because I have a feeling that he starts out... Yeah, he also says that Carey did not understand Ricardo. Okay, here we go. Carey. He's okay. First of all, fun fact, you know the Düring, as in anti-Düring? Big fan of Carey, actually. Apparently. Here's how Marx, let me see, is this Marx? Yeah. Marx writing to Engels describes Carey as, oh no, that isn't his footnote. Yeah, so actually... Let me see... Is actually quite critical of Carey. Marx had been quite critical of Carey in the past as a harmonizer, i.e. one aiming to show that the interests of capital and labor are in harmony rather than antagonistic, as Marx believes. He explains to Engels in a mocking tone that Carey had formerly preached free trade but had now arrived at protectionism as the solution to all of America's economic ills. Yeah, so actually, he was damning Carey with faint praise, actually.
That's the first kind of glimpse of the economic system of imperialism. When Henry Charles...
The first? Really, the first.
Carey writes about the English system. He's writing about an economic system. But...
Okay, well, if you're fine with it, if you're fine with it, River, okay, that's cool. It's like, it just seemed like a very sort of random personal question to sort of jump out with. But if River's cool with it, then it's cool.
Ultimately, the understanding of imperialism that proliferated and became the most important was the understanding put forward by Vladimir Lenin at the time of the Russian Revolution. When World War I broke out, Lenin came forward and he said that we're not living under ordinary capitalism. Capitalism has entered a new stage called imperialism. And in our Center for Political Innovation textbook...
Oh God! Yes, it's We Are City Builders, which he doesn't show up. He calls this a textbook.
You can find Lenin's definition of imperialism.
Why wouldn't you go and just read Lenin? to find Lenin's definition of imperialism. Oh, that's right. He doesn't get money if you just look up how Lenin defined imperialism.
Lenin wrote this very important book in 1916 called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And in that book, he basically explained why World War I was happening and what the people of the world and what they were up against. This is what Vladimir Lenin wrote, as quoted in our textbook, We Are City Builders. Imperialism is a specific historical stage of capitalism. It is a specific character threefold. Imperialism is monopoly capitalism, parasitic or decaying capitalism, moribund capitalism. The supplanting of free competition by monopoly is the fundamental economic feature, the quintessence of imperialism. Monopoly manifests itself in 5 forms. 1, cartels, syndicates, and trusts. The concentration of production has reached a degree that gives rise to monopolistic associations of capitalists. 2, the monopolistic position of big banks. 3, 4, or 5 giant banks manipulate the whole economy of America, France, or Germany.
Okay.
3, the seizure of raw material by trusts and the financial oligarch.
I mean, it's just... It's interesting. It's like he's trying to bridge a sort of a gap. Like, because remember, his big thing, his big reveal was that he's no longer pretending to be a communist. But he's got all these, he's got this following, small as it may be, inexplicable as it definitely is, full of people who thought that this was going to be about doing communism. And now he's saying, no, actually, we're not pretending to do communism anymore. We're doing some bullshit called innovationism. and I have to wonder if in a year's time he will just leave out the Marx and the Lenin and everything altogether, and it'll just be this like Kerry bullshit.
Finance capital is monopoly industrial capital merged with bank capital. 4, the economic partition of the world by the international cartels have begun. There are already over 100 such cartels which command the entire world market and divide it amicably among themselves until war redivides. The export of capital, as distinct from the export of commodities under non-monopoly capitalism, is a highly characteristic phenomenon and is closely associated with economic and territorial partition. And 5, the territorial partition of the world into colonies is complete. Now that's what Lenin was explaining when he described how capitalism was in a completely new stage, and that everything we kind of knew about capitalism was being redefined.
Except, I mean, it wasn't really, though. It wasn't really being redefined. And, I mean, especially because all of this consolidation and stuff, that was kind of something that was predicted was likely to happen. Sorry about that. That was kind of predictable. Sort of the consolidation of capital into fewer and fewer hands, and, you know, the formation of monopolies was kind of... There was some guy in particular who said that capitalism was always going to tend towards that. So, I mean, to say that you could just sort of fundamentally throw out everything doesn't seem right, and I don't even think Lenin probably thought that.
Now, what was Lenin describing? Number 1, he's describing the supplanting of free competition. And this is something that that a lot of people that fall into the libertarian mindset and the neoliberal ideology will say, oh, well, the problem isn't capitalism, Caleb. It's that we don't have real capitalism because there's not free competition. The government is heavily involved in maintaining the power of these gigantic corporations. That's called monopoly, right? We don't have free competition.
Oh, well, no, it's called capitalism. Like, the whole thing depends on the state being there to enforce the property rights on which the whole thing is based.
We do have a government that is in bed with the biggest and largest corporations, and that government rigs things in order to secure the power of those.
It's almost like governments are sort of an executive committee to manage the affairs of the capitalist class.
Those corporations, that government sits down and lets those corporations write the laws, and that government actually goes to war around the world.
I mean, actually, it is worth noting, it is literally true. There are lobbyists, like, literally write a huge amount of legislation. The ACA, which Democrats try to act like we should treat as the end-all, be-all of healthcare, Like, the whole debate should be, keep the ACA, get rid of the ACA in favor of just this shit, but without that. A WellPoint executive literally wrote that.
Secure the monopoly and the profits
Former
of those
WellPoint
corporations.
executive.
And that's not classical free market, and that's not the industrial era of robber barons and steel trust magnates and all that. This is an era where most corporations are tied in with big banks. Banks sit at the center of a number of different industries.
Yeah, except, again, finance and industry are always tied together in capitalism because of the money.
And these
that's
trusts,
how the money works.
And syndicates, these huge centers of economic power with a bank in the center of it, a bank that's the lifeblood by supplying the credit, and various manufacturing corporations that tied in it. They dominate the world. And what is he writing about? Well, first of all, bankers are in control. It used to be that the people who ran capitalism were factory owners.
Yeah, except, again, those bankers are often also part factory owners. I mean, you can't separate these things out. And the only people who try to act like these things can be meaningfully separated tend to be people who are trying to derail a critique of capitalism and move it over into just a critique of finance, which always ends up being some pretty dodgy shit.
Made products. Well, now
the
people who run things in the age of monopoly capitalism are bankers, people who lend money. The financiers who lend money at interest. They don't make products, they make money.
The capitalists don't make the products either. Workers make the fucking products.
Money by having money. Right? They give people money, and then they pay it back with interest, and that's how they make their money. They're not creating any physical value. They're simply increasing their wealth by having wealth. They pump money into industry.
Yeah, but literally, they're increasing their wealth. I wonder if there's anyone else who, in capitalism, increases their wealth just by having wealth, while other people do all the work. I wonder if there's anyone else like that.
They pump money into various places, and then the money comes back to them. And what is one of the main ways bankers make money? Lending money to the government. Did you know that when you pay your taxes, that money is not actually going to pay for things like schools and hospitals?
Well, it's also going for those things.
In the military? No, your money is going to pay back the banks that the government...
that's another thing it's also going for.
Borrowed money from to pay for the schools and hospitals and all of those things. And these banks lend money to the government, and the government pays it back at interest.
Yeah, this is incidentally why the only people who should be getting pissed off about deficits and the debt ceiling and all this bullshit are fucking bond traders. They're literally the only one who is harmed by that. The deficit doesn't mean shit to most people. It has absolutely no effect on anyone's life. But the people who are constantly obsessed with cutting the deficit, on the other hand, are very much doing things that will ruin people's lives.
And that is how these banks make money. And these banks sit at the center of trust cartels and syndicates. And it's monopoly capitalism, where these big monopoly corporations, their monopolistic position is maintained by the government. The government rigs everything to make sure they have what they want. The government lets them write the laws. And the government goes to war around the world and uses its power as a state to maintain their monopoly.
Except what you're describing is actually where Britain was in the early 19th century, to a great extent, already. So it was definitely not entirely novel when Lenin was writing about this.
And libertarians look at this and they say, well, that's not real capitalism. You are correct. It is not industrial capitalism.
Well, it is real capitalism. This is how capitalism fucking works. It literally is real capitalism.
It is the natural conclusion of capitalism. It is monopoly.
It is real capitalism then. That's like saying that the wine, if you have some wine and that shit, you put it next to a radiator or something and that shit turns into vinegar. Oh, it wasn't real wine. No, it's real wine. This is what real wine does when exposed to the right temperatures, or the wrong temperatures, really, depending on whether your goal was to make vinegar out of it or not.
monopolistic capitalism. It is capitalism in its monopolistic stage, right? One thing that you will learn is, if you study the market, is that capitalism is constantly moving toward monopoly. And in fact, that's why we have antitrust laws. We have all kinds of laws that are written to try and prevent monopoly. The way capitalism...
Yeah, like, I mean, so what you're just directly contradicting what you just said. I'm going to skip ahead. I mean, the thing about him is he repeats himself a lot.
From British corporations. It was territorial partition. There's many examples of this. Many examples of this. Imperialism is...
Oh, yeah, I love that. Many examples, and then he doesn't give any. He never gives any.
The export of capital, these gigantic corporations going all over the world and using the world as a captive market. They prevent these countries from developing their own industries, from controlling...
Yeah, I mean, and this is incidentally literally what the British Empire did, and they called it free trade. This is what the U.S. still does.
Their own natural resources, and the profits from the markets of these countries go into gigantic mighty cities like the London Stock Exchange, like Wall Street, New York, like Frankfurt Financial District in Germany, like Paris has got a stock exchange, and that these big monopolistic corporations, they run the government, and the governments use them to seize...
Well, yeah, but I mean, the thing is, it's not like, I mean, the earlier stages of capitalism, the bourgeoisie were also fucking running the government. That isn't new. Like, it isn't... Rich people were already very much the ultimate deciders of what the government would do. I mean, at any stage of capitalism. Actually, you know, kind of at any stage of feudalism as well. I mean, if you piss off the people who actually have all the money and own all the shit that people need in order to live, your government's not going to last very long, because there are very clear things that people like that can do if they're in that position.
Sections of the world as their captive markets, as their territory, and then the governments go to war to redivide the world, and that's what World War I was. Big sections of Africa were controlled by the French. Big sections of Africa were controlled by the Belgians. Big sections of Africa were controlled by the Germans. Big sections of the Middle East were controlled by the Turks.
I mean, actually, relatively small sections of Africa were controlled by Germany. That's part of why Germany was pissed off and had World War I in the first place. So part of what they were trying to improve on. They felt they got screwed over because they had Namibia and, like, Tanzania, two relatively small by the standards of Africa, which is enormous, non-contiguous territories. And they wanted more. They felt that they were getting screwed over by Britain and France and the other countries that actually, you know, occupied the lion's share of Africa.
Big sections of the world were controlled by the British. And so the Austrians and the Germans and the Turks went to war with the British and the Americans and the French, fighting over the colonized world. What sections of the world would be their captive market? This is not colonialism. This is imperialism.
Well, I mean, it's also colonialism because they literally were colonizing the place. Like, there's a reason that there's a town in Namibia called Swakopmund on the coast. And you will if you look it up, you will find all sorts of videos of Germans who are like, wow, this place is so German and stuff. The reason that place is so German is because Germany fucking colonized it. In fact, I mean, if you look at the Namibian rugby team, it's been a while since I've watched... I watched the Namibia play rugby once, maybe 10 years ago. I don't really follow rugby. But there's a reason that in Namibia, the rugby team was just 11 white guys. That's because the place was colonized. In fact, I mean, there is still a fair bit of German spoken there. And there are a lot of Germans who will go to Swakopmund and they'll be all excited about it. And I can understand that on a certain level because it's kind of neat to find a place that feels like Germany on the other end of the planet. But when you know that they also did a huge fucking genocide in Namibia in order to maintain control over the place, then it feels a little bit, I don't know, just kind of vaguely icky. Like, so yeah, there was colonization going on there.
This is an economic system. They wanted the profits from the global market to go into their pockets, but there were sections of the world where the
Yes, and they also wanted the labor in those areas to be assisting in making those profits go to them. And that was like why Germany did genocide in Namibia and Tanzania, because there were people, the Herero and the Nama in Namibia, and I'm not sure who in Tanzania, who were not actually all that keen on doing slave labor for Germany so that some rich fucking Frankfurt or Berlin, would see his shares go up 1/4 point. Like, there's just so much that is just so fucking bizarre. The idea that there is some sort of bright line you can draw between colonialism and imperialism. Like, you can have colonialism without imperialism? No, you can't.
We're going into other people's pockets.
Colonialism is part of what imperialism
and Germany
does.
And Britain and the United States and Belgium and Turkey, they all went to war with each other over trying to redivide the world of who got to soak in the profits from around the world. And this is very, very important because of the fact that many people, and this is infuriating to me, and I must.
Oh,
repeat
okay, it's infuriating to me.
this over and over and over again. That imperialism is not about development.
Well, it's about somebody's development.
Imperialism is about holding back development.
Okay, but it's holding back some people's development in some parts of the world in order to promote the development of the country the imperialists are from. But either way, it's still about development in a sense. It concerns the subject of development,
and that is what people don't understand. Right?
What people? Who doesn't understand this? This is a really, really basic point that you did not explain well or entirely accurately.
Have you ever seen the movie Avatar? You ever seen the movie Dances with Wolves? There was an awful movie made during Donald Trump's first term in office called Beatrice at Dinner with Selma Hayek. There is this weird hippie narrative that imperialism is bringing electricity and it's bringing education.
Yeah, the hippies, they're always talking about how imperialism is bringing electricity and education. That's what I know hippies for. You run into one of those hippies that are like, man, have you seen all the electric lights that the imperialists are putting in? Like, groovy, man. Like, what? Is he an AI chatbot?
And it's bringing, modern technology. And imperialism is bad because these beautiful primitive people, these beautiful, Africans living in tribal conditions and, in the Sahara.
Well, okay. Translating from Caleb, what he's talking, he doesn't want to talk about the fact that in order to do all this, in order to bring this technology for the sole purpose, really, of facilitating resource extraction, to extract wealth from the colonized, invaded, occupied territories, and take it back to the imperial core. You do bring some technology, but the thing that that apparently hippies are saying, because it's 1964 or something. He's mad he has to repeat. All he fucking does is repeat himself and pause. Like, what he's, like, referring to without wanting to actually even say what the critique is the destruction of the natural environment in these places.
or whatever, these beautiful indigenous people living in parts of Guatemala that are not electrified. They're living in this beautiful state of nature, where the evil white man with his modern electrification and his modern
like the issue, Jesus Christ, it's like the issue is not that like imperialists fucking made mains power available to indigenous people, which a lot of the time, of course, they didn't. In a lot of places, they still haven't. Like, like those are, like, indigenous communities are often not necessarily all that reliably connected to the grid because rich people don't give a fuck how comfortable they are. But the issue isn't that. Like, he's talking about, like, hydroelectric dams and stuff like that, destroy food sources and ecosystems in which people have been, in which people have lived, in which people have maintained for, thousands and thousands of years in some cases. And it's not that they're bringing them electricity and that's bad. They're displacing them. They're often killing them to put in hydroelectric dams to provide electricity to people other than them. Like, he can't even get, like, the bad faith critique right.
Running water and his modern cell phones is, like, taking them out of their natural beauty.
That's, like, I mean, okay, there are some dickheads who will say shit like that. I didn't see Avatar, but I've heard enough about it that I'm pretty sure the issue in Avatar, and chat, please correct me if I'm wrong here. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But my understanding was the problem was you had this empire that invaded this, the Avatar planet, whatever the hell it is, and against the will of the people who lived there was taking it over, stealing all their shit, and destroying the environment without actually being providing any kind of real benefit to them, never mind actually seeing what they felt like.
And that's what imperialism is. And that's not what imperialism is. That's some kind of weird hippy-dippy fantasy that has nothing to do with what imperialism is.
Hippy-dippy fantasy. Like, what decade is he from? I mean, just look at the video quality. He's not from the current decade, clearly, because this is like 720, and the camera's right up against him, and he is so fucking blurry. I had a fucking my first digital camera that I bought like 2004 or something like that. Got this level of resolution.
There are big sections of the world that don't have running water. There are big sections of the world that don't have electricity. There are big sections of the world where they don't have access to modern plumbing and they don't have education. And you know why that is? That's because of imperialism. Imperialism keeps countries in poverty. It doesn't bring development. It holds back development.
God, it's like, no wonder he does not notice when that Carrie is just describing two sides of the same fucking coin, because he doesn't understand two sides of the same fucking coin. Because here's the thing, imperialism, okay, like if you travel around in, say, Latin America, just to name like the one that I'm most familiar with, although my understanding is that's fairly similar if you go to places in Africa or other places, is that colonialism and imperialism, imperialism in its like colonialist phase did actually develop certain parts of the countries that it invaded and occupied. Like in Chile, for example, the way that looks is that you have like Santiago and Valparaiso, where huge amounts of money poured into those. Why? Because because that is where you had these British consignment agents and people like this, whose entire job was essentially to sort of manage the extraction of wealth from Chile for the benefit of British capital. And so, like, you go to like the capital, you go to Santiago, and I mean, especially if you go to the east side where the rich white people live, and it is as like posh and sparkling a fucking metropolis as you will find in the rich part of just about any city in the U.S. I mean, and it is also just white as fuck. It is like creepily white for a country that mostly isn't. It's children of the corn white. You feel like they're gonna like pull you over and check whether you're a natural blonde. But the thing is, the reason that you have that level of development in certain places is because it was of value to the wealth extraction process, the extraction of resources and of surplus value from labor in these places. And so there's a whole lot of money goes into those. Same with the infrastructure. Like, the reason, like, Chile has one really, really good road. Ruta 5. Travels most of the length of the country, always in pretty good shape. It is the main highway, and I mean, nothing goes in or out of the country, or really moves around within it without spending some time on the Ruta 5. The reason that road is always in such great shape, even though the infrastructure in Chile is often not in great shape, is because that's where the mining companies take the fucking stuff that they took out of the ground, well, that Chilean workers took out of the ground, and they go from, like, Oficina El Teniente, or, you know, San Pedro de Atacama, and all these other mining towns, with their big trucks of all this, you know, copper ore and all this other shit. And then they take it to Antofagasta, and they take it to Iquique, and the other ports. So they need really good infrastructure to do that, because that's heavy machinery. And it's going through a desert. So you need good infrastructure, otherwise the fucking whole wealth extraction process is going to fall apart. So yeah, actually, it does it brings a very specific kind of development to the parts of the, you know, colonized, invaded country that are key for resource extraction, while at the same time where most of the working class who's doing the hands-on bit of that resource extraction generally don't get much of a look in unless it becomes somehow useful. Like, if it turns out that diseases are spreading to the, you know, like infectious diseases are spreading from working class communities to, like, the rich people who are doing the resource extraction, then maybe the working class community gets drainage and sewers and plumbing and shit. But most likely they don't. Otherwise. So it's like, it is like fascinating to watch him, because it's like he does not connect things. He just has these random factoids badly butchered, and he doesn't notice how they connect up. Or when he does connect them up, he connects them up in a way where he's like gonna do some fast shit.
Development. Okay? That is what you need to understand. Under Gaddafi, Libya became a fully industrialized country. It wasn't until they had an anti-imperialist revolution and an Islamic socialist named Gaddafi took control of Libya and seized control of its oil resources that Libya had a modern electrical system and electrified the entire country. It wasn't until Gaddafi showed up and took control of the oil resources.
I mean, it's interesting that he always brings it back specifically to Gaddafi. Like, you can say this about so many there's so many examples of this. I mean, Allende was doing stuff like this. Like, pretty much everybody who has ever been couped by the CIA, or, you know, subject to attempted coups by the CIA, was doing a little bit of this.
Is that Libya had a modern educational system, right? Libya had been occupied by the Italians. It had been a colony of Italy, and the people living there had remained poor, and the Italians had been happy to take their oil, but most of the country was fully deindustrialized.
Well, yes, because again, the kind of development that imperialism brings is the sort of development that is useful for fucking wealth extraction. And I mean, and the hippy-dippy critique that he is, like, trying to lampoon here, it isn't so much about giving indigenous people fucking smartphones. It's about destroying the places they live in order to provide electrical power that they do not benefit from, and that, for the most part, just goes to people who are extracting wealth from the country.
And it was living in extreme poverty, malnutrition, etc. And it wasn't until they had an anti-colonial revolution that Libya became fully industrialized. Nigeria is a great example. Nigeria is an African country that is the
well, okay, you got that right. Very good. Nigeria is an African
top
country.
Exporter of oil on the African continent. There is no country in Africa that sells more oil than Nigeria. And in Nigeria...
And I mean, and here's another example of what I'm talking about. Because I've seen, like, the areas of the major cities of Nigeria. I've not been to Africa. Curious to go sometime. But, you know, I've seen them through GeoGuessr and stuff from, like, movies and stuff. But anyway, you look at you look at the places where the people who are directly involved in the resource extraction live, and it is as high a living standard, you know, as high a standard of development as you will find anywhere in, like, Europe. But that sort of development only applies, but, like, the development is very uneven, even within the country, because it is primarily to do with facilitating wealth extraction.
The life expectancy is quite low, and the rate of literacy is quite low, and the infant mortality rate is very high. And many people living in Nigeria do not have electricity in their homes, do not have running water, and live in very extreme conditions. Many children in Nigeria do not go to school and never learn to read and write. And that's because they're under the domination of BP and Shell and Chevron and ExxonMobil. BP, Shell, and Chevron are not showing up in Nigeria and giving electrification.
Yeah, like, yeah, true. I mean, well, they are, like, there was I think electrification probably happened when it was still, like, I think it was when it was still, like, a British colony. But, I mean, again, that electrification was primarily centered in the places where resource extraction was out. I mean, it's like, and then this other thing was like the hippies are complaining that imperialists provide education. That's not what they're complaining about. Like, let's decipher that. Because to the extent that these people he calls hippie are complaining, it's probably because colonizers destroy indigenous languages and destroy indigenous cultures, and to the extent that there is any education available, it is essentially cultural genocide, as opposed to an educational system that also integrates the language and culture of the people into the fucking teaching. I mean, it's like, it's just so, it takes a long time to actually make sense out of what he's accusing people of thinking, because it's like he is incapable of simply reporting what they say as they would put it.
They're not showing up in Nigeria and building schools to teach people. No. They show up in Nigeria and they extract the oil. And they electrify only to the extent that they need to extract the oil. And they leave the population in utter, complete poverty.
So, well, wait. Again, the population... Yeah, most of the population, yes. But there are segments of the population who are very crucial to, play a crucial role in, sort of facilitating that resource extraction on, like, a state level. And those people tend to be very well off. I mean, that's true basically anywhere you go in, like, the imperial periphery. You will find, like, very, very, very rich people, and they are always connected in some way. Even if they're not personally doing this sort of work, their families have a history of it. Of being sort of the brokers in the relationship between the extraction, between the wealth of the country and the capitalists elsewhere who want to extract it.
I mean, there's many, many examples of this, right? You know, Guatemala has been under the domination of U.S. imperialism for a very long time. And to this day, there are sections of Guatemala where people don't speak Spanish. They speak indigenous languages.
Is that a bad thing? Of course they speak indigenous languages.
People do not have running water, where people do not have...
Wait, is he saying that speaking indigenous languages as opposed to Spanish is the same as not having access to plumbing?
Electricity, where people live in very desperate conditions. And the United
States... why the fuck did you add the fact that they're speaking Quiche and not Spanish? Like, what kind of colonialist bullshit is that? Like, it is possible to have running water and speak an indigenous language.
The States has been dominating Guatemala for hundreds of years, but they've...
Wait, the United States has been dominating Guatemala for hundreds of years? The U.S. has barely been in existence for hundreds of years. I mean, it's like 1776, 1976, so like, what, 200 and, like, going on for 250 years. And the U.S. wasn't really in a position to start taking over anything in Latin America for a while at first, because they still didn't really have, they were still expanding internally, expanding inland within, this section of Turtle Island they'd already colonized. So hundreds of years? No. I mean, Spain was exploiting them for part of that time. Britain actually did too, I believe. I'm pretty sure about that. Let me just make sure. I know that, I mean, certainly the British Empire did have territories that they colonized near Guatemala, like Belize.
Never dealt with this issue. Why? Because they're there to hold back development.
Well, it's not that they're there to hold back development. It's that they are there to only allow the sort of development that suits them.
That's the point, right? That's the point. And they, 1953, Guatemala elected a guy.
I mean, this whole thing where it's like, they speak indigenous languages and that's the same thing as not having plumbing. I mean, a woman just defended, like, I guess it might have been 2 years ago now, her doctoral dissertation in Peru, in Quechua. Like, is that the same thing, Caleb, as not having running water? Like, does she have to switch over to Spanish so she can get the running water? Like, why add that in there? I mean, it's like, yes, it is true. There are, like, areas all over Central America and including, like, lots of parts of Mexico where Spanish is not really the primary language because people are still speaking their indigenous languages. They've preserved them this long. I mean, that's true, but, like, why are you putting it in with these other things? Das finde ich eigentlich auch interessant.
A guy named Jacobo Arbenz, who was trying
Jacobo. Pelotudo.
To industrialize Guatemala.
Jacobo.
And the United Fruit Company was worried that they would seize their products, and so...
well, no, they weren't worried that he would seize their products. Okay, he actually did expropriate United Fruit. And United Fruit complained because there was no compensation. So he said, okay, we'll do compensation. We will pay you compensation based on the value of the land as expressed in your tax returns. We'll pay you back for what you paid us taxes on. And they said, oh, fuck that. You think we were paying taxes on the full value, do you? And yeah, then the CIA unleashed genocide on Guatemala, and it continued for like 30 fucking years. I mean, on a certain level, that stuff still hasn't really been, it hasn't really totally ended. The aftermath is still going on, certainly. But, it wasn't that they were worried about their products being seized. It was the land. He wanted to do a land reform so that the people who were working the land could also own that shit.
So the CIA overthrew them, and there were a string of military dictators who were in power, and they kept Guatemala underdeveloped. And there's many examples of this.
I mean, he keeps on talking about this as if that is somehow, like, they specifically said, we're going to keep Guatemala underdeveloped. That's our thing. That's our goal. We want to underdevelop Guatemala. No. Like, if there were a way to get maximum wealth extraction and profit repatriation and all that shit for the companies that owned all the land in Guatemala, companies like Chiquita, for example, used to be called United Fruit. They decided to change the name probably because United Fruit was the most blood-soaked brand ever. But now, I mean, Chiquita doesn't exactly look great, given their history in Central America and Colombia. But Jesus. but the idea wasn't they just want to underdevelop these places because they're like evil. The point was that they only they were pushing development to the extent that it was useful to them, and a lot of development they didn't see any benefit in. And that actually, and the amount of development they felt was useful to them changed at various times. Because you had things like, you had this sort of like liberal reformism around the Alianza para el Progreso, and all sorts of like U.S. initiatives that were mostly there to give at least some impression that, aligning with the U.S. would result in better living standards, because to counter the fact that aligning with the Soviet Union definitely was resulting in better living standards in a lot of places. And they wanted to showcase that, so in order to compete better, they did some developmental projects. I mean, guys like Eduardo Frei Montalva in Chile were an example of that kind of thing. He was the president before Allende. He was involved in the coup, and then he realized that that was a bad idea. So he spoke out against the coup, and Pinochet had him murdered with weaponized botulism, because, yeah, wonderful guy, Pinochet. But, yeah, I mean, it's all this sort of, so the idea was you had this sort of reformism, this sort of, like, a little bit of liberal developmentalism as a treat, in order to push, to sort of suppress still the calls for more fundamental change. So, I mean, the idea, he's talking about it like, it's like, we're just going to undevelop the places. Like, that was the goal. That's not how any of this works. God, like, why does anyone listen to this motherfucker?
Big sections of Colombia, where the people live in extreme poverty and are underdeveloped. Why? Because Colombia's government is a puppet of the United States and has kept them in underdevelopment. And
I mean, I would say, yeah, through much of Colombia's history, modern history, certainly. Less so now. I mean, Petro, it's worth noting, is nowhere near as radical or anywhere near as anti-imperialist as leftists, English-speaking leftists in the U.S. or Europe seem to think. Like, it's really, English-speaking leftists in the U.S. and Europe really ought to just fucking learn Spanish. Because you keep on assuming that you hear somebody is, like, you hear somebody in, like, the fucking New York Times being called as a leftist leader or something like that, and you immediately assume it's the fucking revolution, when if you actually, like, have contact with, like, comrades in those countries, they'll be like, oh no, we hate that fucking guy, he's the guy who snitches on us to the cops. Yeah, he's just a fucking lib. But, you know, I mean, Petro certainly has been standing up to the U.S. in various ways recently, at the very least rhetorically.
I mean, there's many examples, right? The century of humiliation that China was subjected to, right? China, it fought 2 opium wars. What were those wars? Well, the British wanted to control China's market, and the emperor of China didn't want them to have control. And one way that the British were able to control China's market was by importing opium, a drug that destroys people, a very addictive drug that destroys people. Well, the emperor...
I'm glad he explained to his audience what opium is.
...saw that the British were bringing in this drug called opium, and Chinese people were...
Well, this drug called... What is that?
Getting addicted.
Maybe explain it to us. We haven't heard of these things. We're from another planet.
And destroyed by this drug, so he outlawed the importing of opium. So the British Empire waged an opium war. And what was that opium war? It was
a war about opium. Like, motherfucker, here he's in a loop again. He started out like the British Empire waged an opium war, and what was that opium war? And then he started to explain what opium is, and now he's doing the exact same thing again. He's
forced the Chinese government to lift its ban on importing opium and lift its ban on, and essentially to force China to be under the domination of British corporations and banks. There's one of the biggest banks on Wall Street is called HSBC Bank. What is
There also a parliamentary inquiry that actually resulted, I seem to remember, in some prosecutions in Britain a few years back, actually revealed that HSBC was heavily involved in the coke trade in recent years.
HSBC stand for?
High Society Bank of Cocaine.
Hong Kong, Shanghai Banking Corporation. So it must be a Chinese bank. Well, if that's what you think, you are wrong. It is not a Chinese bank. It is not a Chinese bank.
Is it not a Chinese bank?
A British bank.
Okay, I think from here we're gonna just let a porcupine take over.
This is Alfred.
Are we gonna get porcupine sounds, though, please? I want porcupine sounds.
Alfred is a friendly resident porcupine with a passion for snacking.
Hi, Alfred.
So I just want to say, this week again, thank you so much for joining me. It's always good to see you. I hope you enjoyed the stream. And if you enjoy the stream, please consider supporting the Inès Armand translation project. I've translated 37 of Inès Armand's 38 extant essays and speeches so far. Nee, der verteidigt den Imperialismus nicht, aber der weiß nicht, was es ist. And at the moment, this Inès Armand, for anyone who doesn't know, was
a dodo producer.
Not a dodo producer. Alexandra Kollontái's predecessor at the women's section of the Bolshevik Party at the very beginning of the Russian Revolution and before. And her work was suppressed under Stalin, so it never got translated until I started doing it. And that translation is very much a lifeline for me, so all support for that is very much appreciated.
And fellow snacker, who's always hunting for great animal stories, you could probably see why I had to explore this further. So I reached out to Alfred's landlord, Carrie, to get the scoop. After moving into her new house, Carrie started to find peculiar animal tracks all over her property.
There's little people tracks.
See where all the prints are.
One day, Alfred made his first appearance in her yard.
I want a visiting porcupine.
He was so comfortable, you'd think he owned the place. Initially, Alfred would keep his distance, but his visits became more and more frequent.
Hi, Alfred.
But Then he showed up one day with a leg injury. Poor guy had a limp in one of his front paws. So Carrie called the local wildlife hotline to get her new friend some help. To her surprise, there was a porcupine virus going around the local wildlife shelters, so they couldn't take Alfred in. Instead, they encouraged her to nurture him back to health herself, with their guidance, of course.
Well, I mean, like, hopefully they at least helped her, you know, do a splint. I wouldn't want to try to do an amateur splint on a... Ja, es geht nicht, es geht eigentlich nicht um mein Unbehagen, um das klarzustellen. Die Frage, also mir ging es ja eher darum, dass man, ja, wenn man jemanden sowas fragt, dem jeweiligen, ja, etwas Unbehagen bereiten können. Also, darum ging es mir. It wasn't about, like, my discomfort. I was thinking that, you know, when you ask somebody like that, something that could be uncomfortable to them. Like, I mean, if they're cool, you know, if they're cool with it, I'm cool with it. But it just felt like it was sort of a random personal question that maybe somebody would be uncomfortable with. So I felt it important to say something. But everybody's cool with it, so I'm cool with it.
The mission was simple. Monitor his condition regularly and feed him tons of fresh fruits until he's strong enough to climb trees again.
Hi, Alfred.
Operation Snack Time was a go.
Make noises.
She started feeding Alfred a variety of citrines and apples. Alfred loves apples.
Aww.
She's even got creative in her kitchen and cut him up some fresh fruit salad. So cute. As you can imagine, Alfred was loving this. He visited every day for his daily snack, and he appeared to grow stronger. At this point, I wanted in on the action.
I don't give a shit about the narration so much. I just want to hear porcupine noises.
I decided to pull some dodo strings and send Alfred a very special gift to celebrate his fast approaching recovery.
Boom. Oh my god, I can't wait. I'm so excited.
I don't know. I mean, I have to say, a job that involves sending, like, fruit to porcupines, that I can think of worse jobs than that. I'll send fruit to porcupines. Pay me for it.
Hey, Alfred. Look what the dodo sent you. Come on over. Look what you got. What do you think?
Look at
Shut up, I'm eating.
He's loving it. Here you go, boy, get some apples.
Got one already. Oh, God, there's something about those hands. Okay. This is a quiet porcupine. Okay, there we go. Have a good evening, and I will be back at